Okay, welcome to everyone. We are looking tonight at Parshas Vayakhel. You can find it at the beginning of chapter 35 in Shmos. If you've got the Art Scroll Chumash, it is on page 516. And so we'll take it from near the beginning. Actually, a lot of the commentary, including from my friend, the ha-Kabbalah, relates to the first few verses, which are a kind of prelude to the main theme. The first few psukim describe the mitzvah of Shabbos, the introduction to the mitzvah of Shabbos and Lo Sevaro Eish. And then from that point onward, the Torah takes up at length the Mishkan, the construction of the Mishkan and its appurtenances. Now, this, of course, is a kind of revisitation of the subjects already described in a lot of detail in Parshas Truma and Tetzaveh, but I'd like to look at some aspects which I believe have certainly some novelty value. So the Parsha begins, Vayakhel Moshe kol hadas b'nei Israel, that Moshe gathered all of the children of Israel, the congregation of Israel, and he said to them, this is what God has commanded you to do. And then we have two psukim about Shabbos, having for, I'm sure, no doubt, important and relevant reasons which the Talmud discusses, dealt with Shabbos briefly. The subject matter turns to our theme. Vayomer Moshe in pasuk Daled, Vayomer Moshe el kol hadas b'nei Israel lemar. Moshe said now to all of hadas b'nei Israel, Ze hadavar asher tzivah Hashem lemar. This is what God has commanded. Take from yourselves a donation, an elevated donation to God, etc. Now, what I like to take up tonight is the subject that was in the title to our shir tonight, which is are you eligible to give? So let's consider what the Zohar tells us about that expression. Take from you, from yourselves. So the Zohar says this is Bnei Israel, to exclude who else was there, who else was a kind of party to the deliberations and, for that matter, the experiences of the Jewish people in the wilderness. Was there anyone else there? Well, according to our tradition, but it's actually explicit in the Torah itself, there also was the Erev Rav. The Erev Rav is the mixed multitude. We don't know how many of them there were. The Torah itself mentions Gam Erev Rav Allah imahem, a mixed multitude went up with them. It seems that these were either Egyptians or maybe Egyptian slaves or maybe others who were, present in Mitzrayim at the time of the Exodus, and essentially they were opportunistic. They decided that if the Jewish people are leaving, and if Egypt in any case is in shambles because of all the plagues and all of the turmoil, then they're going to go with the winner, they're going to leave as well. The Torah doesn't tell us much more about them, but it is evident that they were a present, they were a presence rather within the Jewish people for a certain period of time. And according to our tradition, and this again is hinted to in the Torah, they were the instigators of the Chet HaEgel. Now, with that in mind, says the Zohar, that initially in Parshas Teruma, if we go back to Parshas Teruma, take a look at the beginning of Parshas Teruma. If you want to turn back, it's on page 444 if you've got the stone Chumash, but you'll find in any Chumash beginning of chapter 25 in Shmos, Vayder Hashem Moshe lemar, Daber el bnei Yisrael chuli teruma. They shall take for me a donation, me'es kol isha she'idvenu libo. Whoever is motivated, whoever's heart motivates him, should give, and you shall take. Says the Zohar, it is evident that in Parshas Truma, the Torah says clearly that whoever is motivated to give, tichus trumasi. But here in our Parsha, the Torah says, take from yourselves. Says the Zohar, the first time around, in other words, in Parshas Teruma, where the proposal, where the plan for the Mishkan was first articulated, the Torah says, whoever would like to contribute, bevakasha, kol hakavod to him and to her. But between Parshas Teruma and our Parsha Vayakhel, Unfortunately, a lot of water is under the bridge in between. And in particular, as I'm sure you know, we have the dramatic and catastrophic Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf. And according to our tradition, and again, as I said, it's hinted to in the Torah, Eile Elohecha Yisrael, these are your gods, O Israel. The implication is it was the Erev Rav, these mixed multitude, these people who were not natural components of the Jewish nation, who were not, so to speak, like part of the extended Jewish family or Jewish tribe. They were idolaters from idolatrous stock, and the Jewish people were also idolaters in Mitzrayim, as is very well known. But let's say they had the latent capacity to cultivate a relationship with Hashem. We could put it that way. It was latent within them. The Erev Rav didn't have any such natural inclination or capacity, and therefore it was the Erev Rav who incited the Jewish people for the Chet HaEgel. No doubt Klal Yisrael was also complicit in that, in those events. Our ancestors, sadly, bear shared responsibility, but it seems that the initiative and the instigation came from the Erev Rav. Now, so therefore says the Zohar, now in Parshas Vayakhel, speak to Kol Adas B'nai Israel and say, Chume itchem, take from among you a Truma Hashem, to exclude the Erev Rav. When it comes to building the Mishkan now, we don't want the contributions, we don't want to solicit the involvement, and indeed, they're not eligible even to give to the Mishkan. Now, you probably are aware that there's a well-known tradition found in Rashi, found the Rambam, without quoting the same Parshanut, but other sources as well, that maintain that actually the Torah is not recorded in chronological order, but rather Parshas Teruma also took place after the Chet HaEgel, and the whole Mishkan, the whole institution of the Mishkan is only a consequence of the Chet HaEgel and is pursuant to the sin of the golden calf. And the logic is quite straightforward, just at a simple level, that the Jewish people showed themselves to be unable to worship God, to relate to Hashem in a purely abstract manner. They perhaps were too accustomed already to generations of paganism, and they required some kind of physical manifestation, which took the form of this golden calf, and that demonstrated that there is a need for a more structured form of worship. Some have said it's like an institutionalization of the service of Hashem, which was not the ideal. So says the Rambam, so says Seforno, and Rashi seems to have that view as well, because Rashi says that Ein Mukdam Umu'achar Torah, and although the Chet HaEgel is only narrated in the Torah in last week's Parsha, but actually it took place prior to the legislation of Parshas Truma, which lays out the parameters for the Mishkan. This is well known. However, the Zohar and the Ramban and the other Kabbalistic sources and many other sources dispute that idea. And the reason is not difficult to understand, because according to what we've just said, the whole phenomenon, the whole institution of the Mishkan with all of its trappings and all of the whole sacrificial system was only a kind of plan B. It was only legislated by Hashem himself as a response to the frailty, to the spiritual vulnerability of the Jewish people. And even though the logic is there in the sense that, as I just explained before, the Jewish people showed themselves to be unable to serve Hashem purely in an abstract manner, but nevertheless, the Zohar is unwilling to accept that the whole institution is only a response and only came into existence because of the Chet HaEgel. In any case, the Zohar certainly is of that view, and as we've just seen right now, Zohar maintains that the Erev Rav were actually showed themselves to be ineligible to play a part in the construction of the Mishkan. I'd like to just add a little bit here. The Erev Rav represent, as I said a few minutes ago, a kind of opportunistic impulse. They joined the Jewish people not out of a desire for closeness to God, not out of a desire to lead their lives and to be part of a society which is of a superior moral and ethical and legal status than what they had in Egypt. That wasn't their motivation. It was purely self-advancement. It was purely opportunistic. And we have suffered, the Jewish people suffered from the Erev Rav. We find it, Reid ki shiches amcha, your people have become corrupt. We found in last week's Parasha, Hashem said to Moshe, go down from your greatness, because the people that you took out of Mitzrayim, you wanted to accept the Erev Rav. Well, you asked for them, you got them, and look what they've done. And we find other indications of that as well. So we find that the Erev Rav represent a pitfall, a source of grief to the Jewish people. I just want to share with you an idea quite similar to this. It's Purim related. Many years ago, I studied a commentary on Megillas Esther by Rav Zalman Saratskin. Okay, I don't have to tell you about him. Anyway, he was a Torah personality who survived the Holocaust. He was Rosh Yeshiva in Telz, and he, or his son was Rosh Yeshiva in Telz. He wrote a commentary called Chut Shel Chesed, and towards the end of the Megillas Esther, we have the description of how the great turnabout took place, and the Jewish people had the wind in their sails. The enemies of the Jews were feeling a bit they lost some of their eagerness and their enthusiasm for the cause. And after Haman and his sons were strung up, and the king had a change of heart, and as a result, when the fateful day arrived, the Jewish people were able to fight back against their enemies, and they triumphed at that time. Says the book of Esther, Rabim me'amei haaretz misyahadim. Many of the people of the land misyahadim. They became Yehudim. They became Jewish. In other words, they converted. They thought, you know what? Actually, the Jews are doing well. I'm going to join them. Because it says because the Jews were riding high, and Mordechai was the viceroy. Haman had bit the dust, strung up on the gallows. So many of the onlookers thought, actually, I'm going to go with the winner. I'm going to become Jewish as well. They're riding high. Says Rav Zalman Saratskin, this may explain the bitter phenomenon of anti-Semitic Jews, of Jews who are hostile to Judaism and to their fellow Jews. And that phenomenon was one which he encountered in the 20th century. I think he died in the 1950s or thereabouts, or maybe 1960s, and sadly is still with us today as well. Says Rav Zalman Saratskin, maybe those are the descendants of those people who became Jewish not for altruistic reasons, not for reasons of spiritual searching, yearning, and aspirations, but purely for self-aggrandizement and self-advancement. He said maybe those are the ancestors of the people that we experience, whether today or throughout Jewish history, who are actually not even, let's say, they don't contribute, they don't add value to the Jewish people, just the opposite. Of course, I hasten to say that on the other side of the ledger, we have many Gerei Tzedek who are genuine, and some are mentioned in the Torah. Yitro, we learned about him a few weeks ago, the father-in-law of Moshe. Of course, the famous Moabite princess, Ruthie, we call her, who was the progenitor, the ancestress of King David, very well known. Also Shmaya and Avtalion, great sages in the days of the Mishnah. Also Onkelos, we've mentioned Onkelos many times. The translation of Onkelos And of course, more recently, in modern times, we have Avraham ben Avraham, the famous Ger Tzedek of Vilna, and many others until this very day, some of whom I've had the privilege of getting to know as well. So I hasten to balance the picture by mentioning the many Gerei Tzedek as well. But the phenomenon of the Erev Rav, as I said, were the opportunists, and according to the Zohar, that's why it says, K'umei Tchem, take from yourselves. The Erev Rav are not eligible to contribute to the Mishkan because their intention and their role and their position within the Jewish people does not justify their playing a part in this great project. Now, the next comment I want to share with you is of a related nature. Take a look at Pasuk Chaf Aleph, later on in this same chapter, verse 21. If you got the article, it's on page 518. Just turn the page. Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Here we have Vayavo kol ish asher nesa'o libo v'chol asher nadva rucho uso. Now here we have two expressions which are similar to one another. They both reflect motivation. They both reflect a kind of desire and a determination to contribute. In English, sorry, it's rendered, every man whose heart inspired him came, and everyone whose spirit motivated him brought the portion of Hashem. This, by the way, is women as well as men. We find that the women were even, the next pasuk, actually in verse 22, just parenthetically, that the women were even more alacritous than the men. So this is men, this is women. But what is the meaning, or what is the implication? Nisa'o libo, whose heart uplifts him, nadva rucho, and whose spirit moves him. Again, these two expressions clearly have a similar message. So ha-Kabbalah quotes Rav Moshe Alshech, and he says the following. Rav Moshe Alshech was the great preacher in Tzfat. He was the great darshan. He was actually an outstanding Talmudist as well, and a posek as well. He was the Talmud, a long-time Talmud for decades, a Talmud of Rav Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. He succeeded Rav Yosef Karo as the Av Beis of Tzfas, and although he's remembered for his Torah commentary and for his drashos, for his sermons, and he must have been a very gifted orator, but at the same time, he was an outstanding Talmudist and posek as well. Okay, that's just by the by. I've already betrayed many times before my fondness and my weakness for a bit of biographical background. Okay, let me share with you what he says. He says these two expressions, Nesa'o libo, whose heart uplifts him, nadva rucho, whose nadva rucho, whose spirit motivates him, refer to two types of donors. He says there are two types of people who donate. He said one type is the person, mitzad nafsho, that he donates because of his soul. His like spirit is such that he overcomes his natural reluctance to give. He says, betivo, and by nature, this person is possessive. He's not that eager to part with his possessions, with his money, with his wealth. Whatever he has, he wants to keep or spend it for his own purposes, not to give it away to charity. That's his natural impulse. But his nefesh, his soul, compels him. He is, at the end of the day, he's God-fearing. He knows what's the right thing to do. And he donates, maybe even generously, because his spirit, so to speak, dominates his natural lower inclination. And he gives. This is called nadva rucho. His spirit is of a generous disposition, generous motivation. But the second type is nisa'o libo, where his heart, that is to say, his physical inclination is also to give. Nafsho v'gufo ke'echad, donate and they contribute. And that's called Nisa'o Libo. In my opinion, my good friend Bensi Dunner, Zichron Levracha, was such a person whose natural inclination was to give, who he loved to give, he loved to share, he loved to welcome guests, and he gave very generously to all manner of worthy causes. And I think that for me, at least, Bensi Dunner is a paradigm of the second type, the type whose natural inclination, he didn't have to struggle with his Yetzer Hara to give, he wanted to give. I think it would be natural to presume that the one who is naturally generous will give more ultimately than the person who is naturally more possessive, but he has to kind of overcome that, he has to overcome that natural reluctance in order to give. Probably the one who desires to give is going to be more generous most of the time. I'd like to point out another possibility, though, and that is that we might find that the one who naturally gives, so he gives. The one who doesn't naturally give, but in his soul, his ruach knows that he should, maybe he'll give after 120 years. Maybe he will designate a generous bequest in his will. I know of such cases like that as well, of a man, I mean, I did not know him personally, but I learned for many years in yeshiva in New York, and the building that we had in my day was not fit for purpose. It was much too small, and I won't say it was dilapidated, but it was old and in desperate need of an overhaul. And some years after I left yeshiva, they announced plans that they had bought a piece of land. They're building a big new yeshiva building. So I went to visit the new yeshiva. We were living in England already at that time, and I saw a large plaque dedicating the yeshiva in memory of a certain person who I'd never heard of. Anyway, I learned the story. This was a bequest, I think, of about $5 million. This goes back about 20 years. $5 million was a lot of money. It still is a lot of money. And just in brief, the point is, the story was that $5 million came from a homeless man in Detroit who was living in his car for however many years. And for certain reasons, he had a connection to the yeshiva. I don't think he was especially learned or even devout, but he had a soft spot for the yeshiva. I don't know if he ever gave them any money even in his lifetime, probably like $100 or $50, something like that. Apparently, he was possibly eccentric and maybe more than that, but apparently maybe through savvy investing or through other means, he had become very, very wealthy, but he was living as a vagabond. Anyway, he was the benefactor of the yeshiva. Now, of course, he could have given them a lot of money, in his lifetime. For whatever the reason, he was not inclined to do so. But ultimately, he was the means by which the yeshiva, which today, great yeshiva, I mean, that building is a very fine building. You can visit it if you like. It's in Kew Gardens Hills. Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva, which is where I learned for many years in Queens. So anyway, the preferable, no doubt, category is nadva, is nisa'o libo. His heart uplifts him. His heart wants to give. But even a nadva rucho, even the person who gives because his spirit kind of forces him to do so, can also give generously, and certainly that is meritorious as well. These are the two paradigms of the givers. I'd like to now turn finally to a completely different aspect of our Parsha. It is later on, and this is a short passage which is frequently commented upon because Rashi's words are very beautiful. We're not going to deal with Rashi right now, though, because I want to share with you, as we always do in this shiur, the creative and novel approach of ve-ha-Kabbalah. So I'm looking at chapter 38, verse 8. Perek Lamed Ches Pasuk Ches. If you've got the art scroll, Chumash, it's page 526. Now, this is a passage that many Mefarshim speak about because of the beautiful comments of Rashi, and because, as I've alluded to earlier, much of this week's Parasha is a recapitulation of information that has been presented previously. But here's something novel. Vayas es ha-kior nechoshes veskano nechoshes. And he made the laver of copper and its base of copper. B'mar'os hatzov os asher tzavu pesach ohel moed. B'mar'os, a mar'eh is a mirror. Hatzov os, so it's rendered here from the mirrors of the legions who massed, that is to say, congregated in large numbers at the entrance of the tent of meeting. I'll read the Hebrew again. B'mar'os hatzov os asher tzavu pesach ohel moed. Now, the Torah itself doesn't say who were these legions. And doesn't say why they were at the entrance of the tent of meeting, if they were there for the purpose of donating, or if they were there for the purpose of prayer, or they were there just for the experience, if they were there to catch a glimpse of Moshe or the action that was going on at the Ohel Moed. The Torah doesn't say. So Rashi says that these were donated by the women, and the implication of that is from the word mar'ot, mirrors. Who were the ones who had mirrors to donate? The women, and we know previously the women were generous in their donations, so it's not surprising that they donated for this purpose as well. They needed copper, and the women had copper mirrors. Okay, Rashi has a beautiful comment on that, and I'd like to talk more about it. Hashem Mirz Hashem on Shabbos. For those who will be with us, we're going to speak about mirror, mirror on the wall. But for now, since we have only a few minutes, I want to tell you what ve-ha-Kabbalah says, novel approach. He observes, as we've just said, that the Torah doesn't say who were these legions and why were they there, what was their purpose. Says ve-ha-Kabbalah that it may be that the Torah, at least according to Derech HaPshat, is not talking about women, and or maybe be alluding to the women. It's not talking about gathering and massing and legions. He says the word mar'os hatzov os, the word tzava, tzadi veis aleph, means beauty. He says, like we have the word tzvi tif arto, the word tzvi tif arto. The word tzvi means beauty. It means something which is very pleasing, aesthetically pleasing, like we have in Shir HaShirim, b'tzavos o ba'ayalos hasadeh. That means the gazelles. A gazelle is a graceful, beautiful animal, and a gazelle is even in poetry, even in medieval poetry, in many contexts, a gazelle is a metaphor for grace, for charm, and for beauty, for something which is fleeting, because they're fleet of foot. So he said the word maros hatzov os, it refers to the mirrors which were beautiful. Why were the mirrors beautiful? So of course, at one level, a mirror is for the purpose of beautification. That's why the women had it. But the mirror itself was, he suggests, of highly polished copper that was polished to such a reflective sheen that it was excellent for its purpose, provided a perfect reflection. And he says, therefore, when the Torah says that this kior, that this laver was made of copper, he says it was formed from the mirrors, the highly polished, the beautiful reflective mirrors that the women contributed. And therefore, when it says Pesach Ohel Moed, it was at the entrance of the Ohel Moed when the Kohanim would come to begin their avoda. So they would wash their hands, they would wash their feet as well, by the way, because they did the avoda barefoot. And that was at the entrance when they came to begin their service for the day. It was at the entrance. Says ve-ha-Kabbalah, it was like a beautiful adornment at the entrance, like you go into a beautiful banquet hall, or maybe your own home, or maybe you visit the home of some very wealthy elegant hostess. And when you walk in the front door, so maybe there's a Ming vase there or something which is kind of makes a statement, and it's right at the entrance because that's the purpose of it, to make the visitor or the members of the household feel, wow, there's such beauty in this place. So in a similar way, that's how he explains that this was a beautifully reflective copper, and it was an adornment for the entrance. And according to that, he says it makes very good sense. You don't have to fill in words which are absent. You don't have to wonder who were these people massing and the legions. With the beautiful mirrors, and the laver and the base were positioned in order to lend beauty and grace and charm and aesthetic appeal to the entrance of the Beis HaMikdash. Then he actually quotes one of the other commentaries that says that maybe it was so that the Kohen would be able to see the reflection of the women, because the women were in the women's gallery, let's say, and the Kohen doesn't want to look at the women directly, but he would see her reflection in the mirror. Okay, that's a bit maybe speculative, but in any case, this is what he suggests. Let's just summarize as we like to do. So we spoke about Chume Eidchem, take from yourselves, that only the Jewish people were eligible. I actually forgot to mention the first time. That's why it says at the end of this chapter, the end of chapter 25, look at verse 29, it says, Heviu b'nei Yisrael nadav al Hashem. The children of Israel brought an offering to God, because according to ha-Kabbalah, according to the Zohar, the actual donations were only accepted from Klal Yisrael because the Erev Rav showed themselves to be unworthy, because it was they who incited the Jewish people for the Chet HaEgel, and they were essentially opportunists who were never elevated to the level of Bnei Israel. And as I said, they kind of represent maybe even a paradigm for the opportunist who seeks to join the Jewish people for ulterior motives. And we mentioned maybe even in the days of Mordechai and Esther, there were such people as well. Perhaps even we have an echo of their influence, their baleful influence, even in our own days. Of course, we also have, thankfully, many worthy and righteous, inspiring Gerei Tzedek as well. We spoke about the two types of donors: the donor who has to overcome his natural possessiveness, and the donor who wants to give naturally. And probably he's going to be the more generous donor. Maybe the first category will only give in his will. He'll say, after I die, I'm going to give this amount to charity. And some of those people perhaps can be very generous as well. Finally, we said Bamar Osatzov Os, the word Tzava, Tzadi Veis Aleph means beauty. And the mirrors were beautiful. They were polished in a highly skillful manner. And this was the adornment at the Pesach Ohel Moed. Again, a novel, creative idea of ha-Kabbalah. Thank you again for joining us. And I wish everybody Shabbat Shalom.